The dust on dry 9 tasted like iron and old salt. Kessa licked her cracked lips, spat, and kept digging. Her shovel struck something hard, and she crouched to brush the grit away with her 4-fingered hand. A buried metal box, dented and scratched, with a faded blue circle painted on its lid. Her grandfather's old beacon. She had not seen it in 20 cycles. She almost left it there, almost. But something about the sky that afternoon felt wrong, too quiet. The mining birds had stopped singing an hour ago, and the heat haze on the horizon shimmered in patterns that did not belong to any wind she knew. So she pulled the box free, wrapped it in her work cloth, and carried it back to the small dome she shared with her daughter Myra and her bondmate, Vel. Myra was 6 cycles old. She had her father's pale skin and her mother's stubborn jaw. She was drawing on a scrap of mined paper when Kessa came in, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. "What is it?" Myra asked, eyeing the box. "An old thing," Kessa said, "from before you were born." Vel looked up from the cookpot. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered, slow to speak. He had been a soldier once in the local militia before the mines became the only work that paid. He looked at the box, then at his wife, and his face did something complicated. "Your grandfather's," he said. It was not a question. He said, "To keep it close," he said. "The man who sold it to him swore on his own blood that it still worked." Kessa set the box on the table. He said, "When the sky burns, press the button. They will come." "Who will come?" Myra asked. Kessa did not answer because she did not know. Her grandfather had never said. He had only said the man who sold it had eyes like the sea after a storm and pale skin and only 5 fingers on each hand instead of 4, a traitor from very far away. From beyond the dead stars, her grandfather had whispered, and then he had laughed at himself for being foolish. That evening the sky burned. It started as 3 new stars at twilight low on the eastern horizon where no stars belonged. Then 6, then 12, then more than Kessa could count. They grew larger and brighter, and then they had shapes long and sharp and tipped with the green flame of Voran engines. Kessa had seen Voran patrol ships before. Every Lothan miner had. They came once a cycle to collect the tribute and remind the colony who owned the dirt under their feet. But patrols were 3 ships, maybe 5, not 40. Vel was already moving. He grabbed Myra, threw a blanket over the child's head, and hauled open the floor hatch that led down into the rock shelter. The shelter was small, barely big enough for the 3 of them, lined with old mine timbers and stocked with water and dried meat. It had been built by Kessa's grandfather, who had not trusted the sky. Down said, "Now." Kessa grabbed the beacon. She climbed down after them and pulled the hatch closed above her head. The first impact came less than a minute later, a deep, heavy thump that traveled through the rock and shook the dust loose from the timbers. Then another, then a long rolling roar that did not stop for a long time. Myra was crying without sound, her face pressed into her father's chest. Kessa sat on the cold floor with the beacon in her lap and stared at the small black button under its dust cover. Her hands were shaking. Above them, the dome where they had eaten dinner an hour ago was gone. She was certain of it. The whole upper colony was probably gone. She thought of her grandfather. She thought of the traitor with the sea storm eyes. She thought of every story her grandmother had told her as a child. The bedtime tales of pale demons who walked on 2 legs and never gave up and never stopped fighting until every enemy was dust. The Voron grandmothers told those same stories. She had heard. The conquered scholars said they were just lessons for restless children. Nobody believed in humans anymore. But the traitor had been real. Her grandfather had touched his hand, and the beacon was warm in her palm. She flipped open the dust cover. The button was a small, dull thing the color of dried blood. She pressed it. Nothing happened. No light, no sound, no vibration. The beacon sat in her lap, dead and stupid, while the world above her ended in fire and noise. Kessa almost laughed. Of course it was broken. Of course her grandfather had been a sentimental old fool, and the traitor had been a swindler, and the bedtime stories had been only stories after all. Then, very softly, somewhere deep inside the box, something clicked. A single, tiny light no bigger than a grain of rice glowed pale blue on the inner edge of the casing. It pulsed once, then again, then steady. Kessa stared at it. Above her, the bombardment rolled on, but down in the shelter, holding her daughter's small hand, she found she was not afraid anymore. She did not know why. She did not know what the light meant. She did not know if anyone was listening or if anyone could come, or if anything in the galaxy could stand against 40 Voron warships. But somewhere very far away, the small blue light was being seen, and that was enough for now to keep breathing. 300 years is a long time to sit in the dark and wait for something that may never come. Petty Officer Terran had not been alive for any of those years, but the listening station felt every one of them. Its corridors smelled of stale, recycled air and old coffee. Its walls were thick with the kind of silence that builds up when nobody important ever visits. The station orbited a small dead star at the edge of an empty quadrant, and its only job was to watch a single line of frequencies that nobody had used in 3 centuries. Terran was halfway through her shift, eating a cold protein bar and reading a paperback novel her sister had mailed her when her console made a sound she had never heard it make before. A soft, 2-tone chime, pleasant, polite, the kind of sound a doorbell might make. She put the novel down. She put the protein bar down. She wiped her fingers on her uniform trousers and turned to the screen. A signal. A real signal on a frequency that had been silent her entire career, her entire life, her grandmother's entire life. She ran the verification. The console asked her very calmly if she wanted to confirm. She confirmed. It asked her again. She confirmed again. The third time it asked, she actually laughed. A small, breathless laugh because the console was acting like it could not believe her, which was exactly how she felt. The signal carried a beacon code from the pre-withdrawal era, authentic, time-stamped, origin verified, a Lothan world called DRT-9 on the far edge of what used to be human-allied space. Terran sat very still for about 10 seconds. Then she picked up the red handset on her desk, the one she had been told during training would never ring and would never be used. She pressed the only button on it. A voice answered on the first half ring. A man, calm, awake, alert, as if he had been waiting his whole life for this exact call. "Confirm," he said. "Confirmed 3 times, sir. Send everything. Then go get some sleep. You will not remember the next few hours clearly, and that is all right." Terran sent everything. Then she sat at her desk and stared at her novel, and could not remember what page she had been on. Far away in a low stone building on the coast of an old continent on Earth. Admiral Hale received the report. She was 63 years old. She had short grey hair, a face lined by weather and decisions, and eyes that the traitor on DRT-9 had once been told resembled the sea after a storm, though that traitor had been her great-grandfather, and the comparison had been about him, not her. She read the report twice. She did not blink. Then she set the paper down on her desk, folded her hands, and said to no one in particular, "Well, there it is." She called the Council of Earth within the hour. The council met in a long room with tall windows that looked out over a grey ocean. 12 members representing the 12 great regions of the planet. They had argued for 300 years about whether the withdrawal had been the right choice. And they had argued for 300 years about what they would do if a beacon ever came back. Most of them had stopped truly believing such a day would arrive. Hale walked into the room without ceremony and laid the paper on the central table. "A beacon has been received," she said. "Verified Drought 9, a Lothan mining colony. They are under attack by what looks like a Voron pacification fleet, 40 ships give or take." The room exploded for 4 hours. They shouted at each other. Some demanded immediate response. Some demanded that the Treaty of Isolation be honored at all costs. Some wept openly because they had family who had argued for the withdrawal and had died believing it was the right and final choice. Some demanded to know who had sold the beacon in the first place 300 years ago, on a Lothan world nobody had ever heard of. Hale waited. She had learned over a long career that the best way to win an argument was to let the other side run out of breath first. When the room finally quieted, she stood up. "There is one clause in the treaty," she said, "that overrides all others. We wrote it ourselves. It says that any soul who carries a verified beacon is under our protection, and that protection cannot be voted away. Not by this council, not by any council. We made that rule because we knew one day we might be tempted to break our own word. We were right to be afraid of ourselves." She paused. "The beacon is real. The soul is real. The protection stands." A vote was forced. It passed narrowly with 3 abstentions and 1 member who wept the whole time and voted yes anyway. Hale went down to the lower levels of the building, to a room with 12 dark screens. She sat down at the central console. She entered her authorization. The screens lit up one by one, each showing a ship that had been sleeping in orbit beyond the moon for 300 years. She did not give a speech. She did not call her captains. She simply typed 2 words into the system, the old wake phrase, the one that had been written in the founding charter of the Outer Watch. "We PROMICD. 12 battleships, dormant since before her great-grandfather was born, opened their eyes in silence and began to warm their engines." Lieutenant Nevan had never liked the smell of victory. It was a strange thing to admit, even to himself, because Voron officers were supposed to love it. The smell of a freshly bombarded world rising through the ship's vents. That faint, scorched metal tang the recyclers could never quite scrub out was supposed to make a young officer feel proud. His instructors at the academy had called it the perfume of order. Nevan had nodded along because that was what you did. But he had always thought it smelled like a kitchen fire nobody had bothered to put out. Dr. 9 had been burning for 3 hours now. The whole bridge smelled like a kitchen fire nobody had bothered to put out. High Admiral Sarrow stood at the forward window with his hands clasped behind his back. He was a tall Voron, lean and grayscaled with the long jaw of the old southern bloodlines. He liked to be looked at. He had positioned himself so that the firelight from the planet below caught the metals on his chest. "Continue the bombardment," he said pleasantly. "Sector 4, then Sector 5. We will be done by evening watch." The weapons officer acknowledged. Another salvo dropped from the underside of the flagship and tore into the colony's mining district. Somewhere down there, Nevan knew were the small living things that this morning had been people. He looked at his console and did not let his face move. He was 28 cycles old. He came from a small farming province where his mother still grew root vegetables in clay soil. His grandmother had told him bedtime stories about the pale demons who never gave up. He had laughed at those stories when he was 9. He had stopped laughing at them when he was 19, when he realized that his grandmother had not been trying to scare him. She had been trying to warn him about something. He still did not know what. The sensor officer cleared her throat. It was a small sound, almost shy. Nevan looked up. "Sir," she said, "I have 12 contacts at the edge of the system." Sarah did not turn. "Voron reinforcements." "No, sir." "Lothan militia." "No, sir." Her voice was getting tighter. "The hulls do not match any known signature. The drive plumes do not match any known propulsion. The computer cannot classify them, sir. So it defaulted to a legacy designation which she hesitated. Read it out, officer. A known human pattern." The bridge went very quiet. Somebody coughed once, the kind of cough that escapes when you are trying not to make a sound. Nevan felt his own breath stop in his throat. He turned to his sensor screen. 12 shapes, long and dark and impossibly clean, had appeared on the outer edge of the system. They had not jumped in. There had been no jump signature. They had simply been somewhere else a moment ago, and now they were here, holding formation with a precision that made the Voron fleet pacification grid look like children's chalk lines on a playground. Sarah left. It was a short, sharp laugh, the kind a man uses to push something away from himself. He turned from the window, and the firelight slid off his metals. A glitch, he said. Run the diagnostic. Whoever programmed that legacy designation into our computers was making a joke. Find it and clear it. Sir, the sensor officer said, they are accelerating toward us slowly. Sunlight only. No weapons charged. Then they are nothing. Continue the bombardment. A new sound entered the bridge. A soft chime, polite, almost apologetic from the long-range communications console. The communications officer froze. He looked at the console. He looked at SAR. He looked at the console again. Sir, he said, incoming transmission on an old broadband frequency. Civilian emergency channel. Rejected. Sir, it is already through. I did not accept it. It accepted itself. Sarah's jaw worked. Put it on. A voice filled the bridge. A woman's voice, calm and quiet, speaking flawless Voron trade tongue with a faint accent Niven had never heard before. She did not sound angry. She did not sound rushed. She sounded like a doctor explaining something simple and necessary to a frightened child. This is Admiral Hale of the Earth Outer Watch. You are firing on a settlement under our protection. Cease all bombardment within 60 seconds. Withdraw your fleet to a distance of 2 light minutes. Prepare to receive boarding inspectors. This is your only warning. Hail out. The channel closed. Nobody moved. Niven looked at the bridge crew, and the bridge crew looked at each other, and not one of them looked at Sarah. That more than anything else told Niven what kind of moment this was in a Voron command structure. Every face turned to the Admiral when an order was needed. The fact that nobody could bring themselves to do it now meant that every officer on this bridge already knew in their bones what the right answer was. And they also already knew what Sarah was going to choose. Sarah chose it. Continue the bombardment, he said, and his voice cracked on the second word just slightly, just enough. Niven watched the seconds tick down on the navigation clock. The guns kept firing, 30-20. The 12 shapes at the edge of the system did not change course. They did not charge weapons. They did not signal again. 10-5. At 0, Niven realized he had been holding his breath the entire time. He let it out slowly, and then the human battleships opened fire. The first shot did not roar. That was the part nobody on the Voron bridge could explain afterward. In the long, quiet hours that followed, Voron weapons made noise, even in vacuum. The firing of a heavy plasma lance sent a shudder through a ship's hull. A deep, mechanical cough that everyone aboard felt in their teeth. It was how you knew the gun had worked. It was how you knew you were the one doing the killing. Human shot did not do that. There was no shudder. There was no cough. There was only a brief, almost gentle line of light drawn so precisely across the dark that it looked more like a careful pen stroke than a weapon. And at the end of that line, the forward plasma lance of the Voron flagship Talvin's Crown simply stopped existing. Not exploded, not melted, stopped. The metal was there one moment and gone the next, sliced away so cleanly that the surrounding hull plating did not even bend. The atmosphere in that section did not vent. The bulkheads did not warp. Nobody died. Lieutenant Niven stared at the damage report on his console and felt something inside his chest go very cold and very still. The second shot 3 seconds later removed the secondary lance on the cruiser to their port side. The third removed the missile bays on a frigate to starboard. The fourth, fifth, and sixth shots took out the dorsal batteries of 3 more ships in the formation. Each shot was a single line of light. Each one took exactly 1 weapon system off exactly 1 ship. Each one left life support, engines, and crew compartments untouched. For 4 minutes, the human battleships fired with the calm regularity of a gardener pruning a hedge. Sarah shouted orders. The bridge crew tried to follow them. The fire control officer attempted to lock onto the nearest human ship. And the moment her targeting solution completed, her fire control panel simply went dark. Not destroyed, not jammed in any way the diagnostics could identify. Just dark as if a parent had reached down and quietly switched off a child's toy. She tried 3 more times. 3 more times the panel went dark, almost politely. When the 4 minutes were over, every Voran ship in the formation was drifting. Not one weapon remained functional across 40 warships. Not one engine was damaged. Not one hull was breached. Not one crew member had died. The whole fleet hung in space like a row of disarmed dolls. Nivan could not stop looking at the casualty count on his screen. 0 across 40 ships. 0. He understood then what his grandmother had been trying to warn him about. The bedtime stories had always told it wrong. The humans were not feared because they were savage. They were feared because they could choose. They could measure exactly how much harm to do down to the millimeter, and they could stop precisely there. A drunken giant smashing a room was something a clever Voran could plan against. A surgeon who knew exactly where every nerve was and chose where to cut, and chose where not to cut and never missed, was something no one could plan against. The surgeon decided everything. The patient decided nothing. That was what real strength looked like. And Nivan had never seen it before in his life. Sarah was still talking. Nivan realized he had stopped listening some time ago. The High Admiral was demanding a counterattack, demanding ramming speed, demanding glory. The helm officer was not moving. The weapons officer was not moving. The communications officer was very slowly and very carefully opening a channel back to the human flagship. "Sir," the communications officer said. He did not look at Sarah when he said it. "I'm going to accept the surrender request, sir. I would be glad if you would countersign, but I will accept it either way." There was a long silence. Then So sat down in his command chair and put his hands flat on the armrests and said nothing at all. He looked, Nivan thought, like a man who had finally heard the punchline of a joke he had been telling his whole life. On the surface of Dry 9, the bombardment had stopped. Kessa noticed it before she heard the ships. The shaking simply ended. The dust in the shelter, which had been falling steadily from the timbers for hours, settled. Myra lifted her head from her father's chest and asked in a very small voice, "Is it over?" Kessa did not know how to answer. She climbed up the ladder and pushed the hatch open a hand's width. Hot air rushed in, smelling of scorched stone and burning plastic, but there was no new noise, no new flame, only a strange deep hum she could feel in her chest more than hear with her ears. She climbed out into what used to be her home. The dome was gone. The neighbors' domes were gone. The whole upper colony was a black, uneven plain scattered with twisted metal and small fires. But descending through the smoke, slow and patient, was a long, dark shape, unlike any ship she had ever seen. It made no engine noise. It cast a wide, soft shadow over the ruined ground. A ramp lowered. A woman walked down it. She was tall by Kessa's standards, pale-skinned with short grey hair and a plain grey uniform that bore no medals at all. She walked slowly with her hands open and visible. When she reached Kessa, she did not speak first. She knelt instead in front of Myra, who had climbed out of the hatch behind her mother. The woman pulled a folded cloth from her pocket in a small ration bar. She offered both to Myra with both hands. The way you offered something to a small wild animal, you did not want to frighten. "Hello," she said softly. "We came as fast as we could. I'm sorry we were late." Kessa's knees gave out. She sat down hard in the ash and began to cry because for the first time in her entire life, someone had said sorry to Althan and meant it. The news reached the Voran-conquered capital before the dust had even settled on Drought 9. It arrived first as a panicked private message between two staff officers, then as a half-coherent emergency dispatched from Saro's deputy, and finally, less than 2 hours after the last shot was fired, as a careful and slightly puzzled report from the Conqueror's own intelligence service, which had picked up the human transmission directly and could find no reasonable explanation for any of it. By the time the council convened, every delegate in the chamber had already heard 3 different versions of what had happened, and none of the 3 matched. The conquered council hall was an amphitheater of 7 concentric rings, 1 for each member species. The Voran sat at the innermost ring, naturally, because Voron architects had designed the building. The Lothan ring, the smallest, was 3 rows back on the left, almost hidden behind a pillar. The empty observer benches at the rear had not held a guest in 200 cycles. When the doors opened for the emergency session, every seat was full. The aisles were full. The press gallery was full. Reporters from every member species pressed shoulder to shoulder against the rails, and not one of them was making jokes. The shouting started before the chairperson could even ring the opening bell. Delegates demanded war. Delegates demanded peace. Delegates demanded the immediate arrest of High Admiral Cerro for incompetence, and other delegates demanded he be given a medal for surviving at all. The Lothan delegate, a quiet old woman named Tella, sat in her seat with her hands folded and said absolutely nothing. She had not been allowed to speak first in this chamber in 40 cycles. She did not expect to be allowed to speak first today either. But for the first time in those 40 cycles, she was smiling. The oldest delegates were the quietest. There were 3 of them, 2 Voreen and 1 of the lizard-shaped bins, and they sat very still and very pale in their seats. They remembered, not personally, of course, because nobody alive was that old, but their family records remembered. Their grandparents had told them in private behind closed doors the real reason the bedtime stories existed. The stories had not been written to warn children about monsters. They had been written by old council members 300 years ago to warn future councils about what would happen if the conquered ever forgot itself. The future councils had forgotten themselves. The doors opened again. A small shuttle had landed on the public plaza outside, and from it had walked 4 humans. No honor guard, no banners, no announcement. They had walked through the public entrance of the council hall like ordinary citizens, paused at the visitor registration desk to fill out the standard paperwork, and asked politely for permission to address the council under the open petition clause. The clerk on duty had nearly fainted. The senior clerk behind her had filled out the form with shaking hands. Admiral Hale walked into the chamber alone. She did not wear her uniform. She wore a plain dark blue coat over a gray civilian shirt. She had no badges. She carried a small folder under one arm. She walked down the central aisle the way a person walks into a public office to file a complaint about a broken street light with that exact air of mild patience. She sat down at the petitioner's bench. It was a low wooden bench at the front of the chamber, used by ordinary citizens with ordinary requests, and it had not been used by anyone significant in 100 cycles. She placed her folder on her lap. She folded her hands on top of it. She waited. The chamber, which had been shouting for 40 minutes straight, went quiet in pieces. First the front rows, then the middle, then the back, then even the press gallery, until the only sound was the soft hum of the climate vents. The chairperson cleared his throat. He was a senior Voran, and he had been in politics for 60 cycles, and he had no idea what to do. The petitioner, he said carefully, may speak. Hale stood up. She did not raise her voice. She spoke in the same flawless trade tongue she had used on Sarah's bridge with the same calm doctor's voice. "Thank you," she said. "I will be brief. I am Admiral Hale of the Earth Outer Watch. I am here to present 3 requests on behalf of the Sol system and its protectorates. I want to be clear from the start that these are requests, not demands. You are free to refuse any or all of them. I would simply like you to know before you decide what the alternative is." She opened her folder. Request 1. The Vorin Conquered will withdraw all military forces from the following 12 systems listed by your own naming conventions within 90 standard days. She read the list. None of the systems were major. All of them held small populations that had been quietly squeezed by tribute for generations. Request 2. The Voron Conquered will pay reparations to Drought 9 and to the 17 other settlements that have been similarly attacked in the past 40 cycles. The amounts are listed in the appendix. They are not large. They are calculated based on rebuilding costs, not punishment. Request 3. The Voron Conquered will accept 1 permanent human observer at every council session beginning today. The observer will not vote. The observer will not speak unless invited. The observer's only job is to be present so that the small species at the back of this chamber know that someone is watching. She closed the folder. "I will wait outside," she said. Please take as long as you need. I would suggest one standard day. She walked out. The chamber did not erupt. It did the opposite. It sat there silent for almost a full minute while every delegate in every ring tried to understand what had just happened. Lieutenant Neven, freshly reassigned as a junior council aide because nobody knew where else to put him, stood at the back wall and realized something that almost made him laugh out loud. The humans were not conquering anyone. They were filing paperwork. 11 hours later, after the most furious debate in the council's recorded history, all 3 requests passed unanimously. A standard year is a long time when you are 6 cycles old. For Myra, it had been long enough to forget the smell of the shelter mostly, and to learn the human alphabet, and to grow 2 centimeters taller, and to win a small wooden trophy in the colony school's seasonal running race. She wore the trophy on a string around her neck for 3 days afterward, and refused to take it off even at bath time until her father gently pointed out that wood and water were not good friends. The new colony school stood on the rebuilt eastern slope of Drought 9, where Kessa's old dome used to be. It was a low building made of pale local stone with wide windows and a soft green roof, and the children inside it spoke 4 different languages on any given afternoon. There were Lothan children, of course. There were also 2 Voron children, whose parents worked at the new trade office, and 1 Bren child whose family had moved from 3 systems away to be near the human observer post. And there was even a single human child, a small quiet girl named Ada, whose mother flew supply runs. The old bedtime stories were taught in the school now, not as myths, as history. The teacher, a patient Lothan named Ressa, made sure every child understood that the humans were not demons. They were also not gods. They were neighbors, very capable ones, who had chosen to be quiet for a long time and had chosen to come when called. Kessa worked at the trade office 2 streets away. Her job was to handle communications between the Lothan Miners Guild and the Human Protectorate, which mostly meant filling out forms and answering questions about water rights. She liked it. She had not realized in all her years of mining how much she enjoyed sitting in a chair with a warm cup at her elbow and helping people sort out paperwork. In the afternoon, the story ends. She was sorting requisitions when the door chimed, and Admiral Hale walked in. Hale looked older than she had a year ago. She walked with a slight limp now, the result of a fall during a ceremonial planting on a different colony. She was due to retire in 3 months, and everyone at the Protectorate knew it, including her. She was making the rounds of the world she had pulled out of the fire, one last visit each, the way an old farmer walks through her fields before selling the land. She had brought Lieutenant Nan with her. He was no longer a lieutenant, technically, having taken a permanent civilian post as the council liaison to the Human Protectorate. He wore a simple gray civilian coat and carried a small notebook, and he had grown a short beard that made him look 5 cycles older than he was. He bowed to Kessa with real respect, and Kessa, who had never been bowed to by a Voron officer before the war, bowed back without thinking. The 3 of them walked through the colony together. Children waved. An old miner shouted Hale's name across the square and held up a cup of fermented root drink in salute. And Hale waved back and pretended she would come over for a sip later, which they both knew was a polite lie. The dust smelled of new grass now, where the bombardment had stopped a year ago. Someone had planted seeds. Navan had been carrying a question with him for the whole year, and on the walk back to the shuttle, he finally asked it. "Why did you hide?" He said, "For 300 years, you had the strongest fleet in the galaxy. You could have ruled the whole arm. Why withdraw?" Hale stopped walking. She watched a group of children chase each other around a fountain, shrieking. None of them are old enough to remember the fire. "Because we learned something the hard way," she said. "Strength used carelessly creates tyrants. Strength hoarded creates monsters. The only safe path was to disappear and to listen and to come back only when truly needed. Not as rulers, not as gods, just as neighbors who happened to have very large ships." Nan thought about that for a long moment. "And if no one had ever pressed the beacon, then no one would have needed us," Hale said. "And that would have been the best outcome of all." She walked on. That night on a Vorin World 6 jumps away from Dirt 9. A small Vorin child sat in her sleeping nook while her mother read her a story. The story was old. The mother had been told it by her own mother, who had been told it by hers, and so on back through more generations than the family records kept track of. The story was about pale demons who walked on two legs and never gave up, and never stopped fighting. The child interrupted her the way children do. "Mama," she said, "are the humans real, or are they just a story?" The mother thought about it. She had heard, of course, the news from Dr. T9. Everyone had. She had seen the footage of the human ships hanging in space without firing a single killing shot, and she had seen the small, gray-haired admiral filing her paperwork at the petitioner's bench, and she had read the new clauses in the council charter. She had also read the same bedtime story to her daughter for the past 3 nights running because her daughter had asked for it. "They are both little ones," she said. "They are both." The child accepted that the way children accept most things, and curled up under her blanket and was asleep within minutes. Above the nursery, far beyond the moon of that world, a single human battleship drifted silently on patrol. Its running lights were dimmed, its weapon ports were closed. Its crew was reading books and writing letters home and eating slightly stale rations and cake in the mess hall. It was not looking for anyone to fight. It was simply there the way a good neighbor is simply there, watching, waiting, and hoping it would never be needed again.